Welcome to your sleepy stories. I'm so glad you're here. This is your time, your quiet space to let the day go and gently prepare for rest. You've done enough today. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these stories and would like to hear more, feel free to like this video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Now, all that's left to do is get comfortable, close your eyes, and let this peaceful story carry you into sleep. Tonight, we'll take a slow, dreamy walk through the dusty shelves and creaking floors of a small Victorian bookshop nestled on a quiet cobbled street in London. Let's begin. Mr. Alcott woke before the sun, not from obligation, but for the simple joy of being awake before the world stirred. The city was still at this hour. No carts rattled on the cobblestones, no bells rang, no boots rushed by. Only the soft drip of rain from a gutter and the low creak of floorboards beneath his slippers. He lit a small lamp with practiced care, easing back the darkness inch by inch. There was something sacred about beginning the day slowly, like unwrapping a familiar gift. His coat hung on the peg beside the stairwell. He slipped it on, tucked the shop key into his pocket, a formality more than a necessity, and padded quietly down the narrow staircase. The bookshop was part of the same building, just below, a narrow, leaning thing with crooked windows and a brass bell that never quite lost its luster. The stairs creaked gently underfoot as he descended, and the scent of old paper and lavender oil met him halfway. The shop had its own kind of memory, and he liked to think it greeted him too. He turned the lock from the inside and opened the front door. The bell above chimed softly, announcing the day. Rain misted the morning air, painting the rooftops and street lamps in silver. The watchmaker's windows were already fogged with breath and time, and the faint scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery down the road. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been. Shelves of books leaned slightly with age. Journals sat in neat stacks by the counter. The fire grate waited patiently for kindling. A single chair by the hearth bore the soft imprint of yesterday's reader. He breathed in the familiar scent, beeswax, ink, and that trace of lavender from the oil he dabbed along the windowsills. He knelt by the hearth and lit the fire. The kindling caught with a satisfying crackle. Then the kettle was set to warm, the teapot retrieved from beneath the counter. One cup for himself, and a second, just in case. With tea in hand, he moved among the shelves, not to straighten or rearrange, only to feel their presence. These books had seen everything, held grief, celebration, boredom, hope. He paused at the second shelf near the window. A slim, blue poetry volume waited there. Inside, a letter, folded neatly, its edges slightly worn. He had placed it there years ago. He didn't recall what prompted him to write it, only that the words had arrived one evening, uninvited but insistent. The quiet places, it began, are where the loudest memories live. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he liked knowing it was still there, waiting, just in case someone needed it. He tucked the book gently back in place, and just then, the bell above the door gave its first proper chime of the day. The rain began as Miss Fenwick closed the gate behind her. Not a harsh rain, but a soft mist that slowed her steps and invited her thoughts to wander. She wore the same grey wool coat she'd worn in her final year of teaching. The collar still held its shape, though the buttons had grown loose. The streets were quieter than they used to be, or perhaps she was quieter in them. There had been a time for hurrying, for darting through corridors and raising eyebrows to restore order. That time had passed. Now she moved slowly, with intention, appreciating the rhythm of her pace. The bookshop stood just beyond the curling iron railings. Its glow reached out into the grey afternoon like a warm hand. She spotted the flicker of firelight through the window and smiled. The bell gave a soft chime as she entered. Mr. Alcott looked up from behind the counter, lifting his cup in greeting. A silent welcome. Her chair by the fire was waiting. Same cushion, same folded blanket on the side. She brushed a few biscuit crumbs from the arm and lowered herself gently into it. From her handbag, she retrieved the tenant of Wildfell Hall, worn, familiar. She always began at chapter 7. A few minutes later, Mr. Alcott brought her tea and a shortbread biscuit. He said nothing. He never did. But he always seemed to know. She read in silence. The fire crackled beside her. The soft rain whispered against the windows. The warmth and stillness of the shop wrapped around her like a well-loved shawl. Miss Fenwick always arrived before the second cup of tea cooled, punctual but never rushed. She came in with the morning air, a little sharper in the colder months, carrying with it the scent of books left too long near an open window. She entered without announcement and moved with the calm assurance of someone who belonged. Her shoes made a soft tap-tap on the timber floorboards, and her umbrella, still glistening with rain, was always folded precisely, leaned against the bookshelf near the fire. She never spoke first. Instead, she settled into her chair by the hearth, with the grace of a bird returning to a well-worn perch. A gentle sigh, a rustle of skirt fabric, the creak of the armchair beneath her slight frame, and then stillness. Mr. Alcott didn't need to ask. He prepared her tea just the way she liked it, dark, without sugar, with a slice of lemon so thin it could nearly be seen through. A quiet ritual, reliable, unspoken. When he handed it to her, she looked up and gave him 2 small nods. One for thank you, one for I'm all right. She never asked how he was, not out of disinterest, but out of something more respectful, a mutual understanding that comfort sometimes lives in not asking, in letting silence hold its shape. Mr. Alcott returned to the counter. Behind it, he began wrapping a parcel in brown paper, the twine pulled tight and tied neatly with a single knot. The kettle still steamed faintly behind him. The scent of bergamot and old wood filled the space between them. The fire crackled softly. Miss Fenwick turned the page of her book with the lightest of sounds, paper brushing against paper. And then the bell rang again. Not loudly, just enough to announce a presence. Another visitor, this one unfamiliar. Mr. Alcott glanced up, not alarmed, merely attentive, as footsteps entered the quiet, bringing with them the soft scent of wet wool and city air. Without hurry, he straightened the parcel on the counter and turned to face the door. The shop, as always, made room. The memory came back sometimes, not with sharp edges, but in a softened way, like pages worn smooth from being turned too often. It was a Wednesday. He remembered because the bell above the door had arrived late, a mix-up in the order, and he'd had to open the shop without it. The first day passed without a single chime. He had unlocked the door just before 8. There was no crowd, no grand announcement, just the quiet creak of hinges and the smell of new varnish over old wood. He'd laid the fire himself that morning, carefully, nervously, afraid it wouldn't catch. But it had, after 3 matches and a whispered word of encouragement, not to the flame, but to himself. The shelves had still been half empty. The shop's original stock had come from an estate sale and 3 boxes of books from his own flat. There were gaps between the volumes, like missing teeth, and it had made him uneasy. He'd brewed tea, though no one came to drink it. sat behind the counter, too alert, back too straight, waiting for someone to walk in and ask for something he couldn't find. But eventually, near noon, a woman had entered, her umbrella dripping, coat too large for her shoulders. She'd asked for a book of poems by a name he didn't recognize. He'd searched the shelves anyway, and after several minutes, found it tucked behind a gardening manual. She didn't buy it. She only smiled and said, "I just wanted to know if it was here." Then she left. He had stood for several minutes afterward, holding the slim green volume in his hands. The shop had been very quiet, but it hadn't felt empty. He hadn't questioned it then. Not the encounter, not the strange request, not even her words. Some part of him understood. He placed the book back where he found it, made a fresh pot of tea, and began to shelve the rest of the donations. Slowly, deliberately. It was the beginning of everything. The door opened with a hush of hinges and the soft chime of the bell. Clara stepped in from the drizzle, her coat clinging to her shoulders, sleeves damp at the wrists. She paused just inside the threshold, unsure if she'd entered too quietly. The scent of beeswax and old pages wrapped around her. There was warmth here, not just from the fire, but from something gentler, something held. She moved a little deeper into the shop, her fingers trailing along the edges of shelves as though tracing the bones of a memory. Her satchel, scuffed at the corners, bounced lightly at her hip. Inside it, a notebook with half-written pages, a pen with fading ink, and a bundle of letters she'd never sent. It was the kind of place her younger self would have adored, the kind of place she used to write about, or in. Near the back, tucked between two books about canal-side villages and old botanical remedies, a slim, grey-blue book caught her attention, cloth-bound, with delicate edging, poetry. The title had long since faded from the spine. Inside the front cover was a piece of paper, neatly folded. Not crisp, not hidden, just waiting. She opened it. The quiet places are where the loudest memories live. There was no signature, just the looping tail of a pen that had moved with certainty. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the ink. The scent of lavender and smoke curled softly around her, and before she realized it, her mind had slipped backward. A memory struck Clara suddenly. She was 17, tucked in the corner of a second-hand bookshop 2 suburbs from home. Her knees pressed against the low table, a chipped teacup balanced near her elbow. A spiral notebook lay open in her lap, the pages filled with crooked poems and tiny drawings of teacups, windowsills and phrases like, "Longing tastes like toast." She used to hide folded notes in books, not because she expected anyone to find them, but because it felt like a secret ritual, like leaving breadcrumbs in the woods. Somewhere, someone might read her words. Somewhere, she might be read. At university, her notebooks multiplied. She imagined herself writing short stories for a living. Quiet, peculiar ones about bookshops and strangers and lost buttons. But lectures took over. Work crept in. 1 rejection letter turned into 6, then 12. She'd never really stopped writing, not entirely. But she no longer left notes in books, until now. She blinked, returning to the present. The note in her hand seemed to warm with some quiet understanding. She closed the book and carried it gently to the counter. Mr. Alcott wrapped it carefully in brown paper, tied with a length of soft twine. He didn't speak, but something in his nod said more than words could. The rain had softened to a hush by the time Clara stepped outside. The parcel rested in her arms, still warm from the bookshop, wrapped in brown paper and twine like a quiet promise. She didn't walk straight home. Instead, she wandered, slowly, past the bakery with its lights now dimmed, past the florist's window where a few stubborn petals clung to the glass, and finally to the edge of the small city park. She paused there, as she often did, not to enter, just to listen. She was 34. She lived alone in a flat with creaky floorboards and a teapot that whistled unevenly. Her desk was stacked with papers she hadn't touched in weeks. A story half-started, letters unsent, ideas scribbled in the margins of overdue bills. Her family lived hours away, a sister with twins, a mother who rang on Sundays but rarely stayed on the line. They loved her, she knew, but there were pauses now, long ones, where once there had been chatter. She looked down at the parcel in her hands. The note. The quiet places are where the loudest memories live. Still echoed gently in her chest. She didn't know who had written it, but somehow it had found her anyway, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, it felt like permission to begin again, to pick up something she'd quietly laid down a long time ago. She stood there a moment longer beneath the lamplight, then turned toward home, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a softness in her step she hadn't felt in years. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking away from something. She was walking toward it. The steam curled up from her teacup in slow spirals, catching the lamplight. Miss Fenwick sat quietly, her eyes on the page, but not reading. Outside, the light had begun to fade. The book in her lap, a slim, well-thumbed volume of translated French poetry, was one she had read dozens of times. She could recite the opening lines by heart. Still, she returned to it often, not for the words themselves, but for the memory they held. She had been 16 the first time she read it. It was a rainy afternoon, not unlike this one, and her father had taken her to the reading room at the university, a privilege she never quite understood how he secured, only that he did it quietly and without explanation. He was not a man of many words. He rarely smiled, but that day he had handed her a book, this one, and said simply, "You might like this." That was all. They sat side by side for nearly an hour. He read newspapers in German, sipping thick black coffee from a flask, while she traced each poem with her fingertip, trying to feel the rhythm beneath the unfamiliar syllables. It was the first time she realized that silence could be shared, that it didn't have to be heavy or cold. It could be something gentle, even kind. Her father had passed not long after that, a quiet illness, a quiet funeral. But the memory of that day and the way the book felt in her hands had never faded. She carried it with her still. Miss Fenwick glanced up, the fire catching the gold in her glasses. Mr. Alcott had returned to his place behind the counter. She gave him a small second nod, the kind that meant thank you, and I remember. The tea had cooled, but she didn't mind. Some things, she had learned, were better when they weren't rushed. The door creaked open, just as the fire settled into a steady amber glow. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the windows like breath. Henry stepped inside slowly, the familiar rhythm of his walking stick tapping softly on the worn wooden floor. His coat was dark with rain at the shoulders and cuffs, his scarf tucked in with the tidy care of habit. He paused near the doorway, as he always did, not out of hesitation, but reverence. The shop greeted him like an old friend. Mr. Alcott looked up from behind the counter and gave a small, knowing nod. Not just of recognition, but of welcome. Henry's gaze moved to the fire, then to the armchair across from Miss Fenwick. She sat with a book in her lap, the edges softened by years of turning. She glanced up and smiled, the kind of smile you save for someone you understand without needing to speak. He offered a faint tilt of his head in return. No words passed between them. None were needed. He crossed the shop with care, his steps measured and unhurried. The floorboard near the poetry section still creaked. He always forgot, then remembered again. That sound, like so many others here, had become part of his memory's fabric. Mr. Alcott appeared a moment later with tea. 1 sugar, no milk, the way Henry had always taken it. He accepted the cup with both hands, wrapping his fingers around the warmth like someone holding on to something more than heat. He sat back, let the firelight touch his face, and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his wife, of their small home with the blue curtains, of the evenings when she would read aloud while he watched the flames dance, of the way his son used to fall asleep mid-sentence during stories, a book still open in his lap, one sock always half off. There had been so much noise in those years, happy noise, and now so much stillness. He didn't come for the books anymore. He came because the shop remembered him, because it held his quiet, and because in that quiet he could still hear echoes of the life he had loved. After her purchase, Clara had left quietly, just as she had arrived. Mr. Alcott hadn't seen her go, only noticed the faintest shift in the room's hush. But near a chair she briefly sat, on a small table, something remained. A single folded page, torn from a well-worn notebook, the crease imperfect. Miss Fenwick noticed it when she reached for her cup. She paused. Her fingers hovered above it. She didn't unfold it, not right away. Something about the way it had been left, so casually but deliberately, made her hesitate. There was writing, ink faint and slightly smudged from damp fingertips. A few lines, possibly poetry, the kind someone writes quickly, not to show, but to capture something before it slips away. Miss Fenwick held it delicately between 2 fingers. She looked toward the door. Clara was long gone. The rain had softened into mist, and the cobbled street outside was quiet again. Instead of reading it, she gently smoothed the page, her palm moving slowly over the paper, like she was closing a book she wasn't ready to finish. And then, with the same reverence she gave her own favorite verses, she tucked it into her own poetry collection, not to claim it, but to keep it safe. Miss Fenwick didn't need to know what it said. She understood the act of writing without needing an audience, of needing to leave something behind just for a moment. She sipped her tea and turned the next page of her book. Clara closed the door behind her and stood for a moment in the hush of her small flat. The walls held that evening's stillness, the kind that presses in around you when no one else is coming home. The parcel, still wrapped in brown paper and twine, rested in her arms like a held breath. She placed it gently on the entry table, kicked off her shoes, and padded down the short hallway in socked feet. The floor creaked in all the usual places. A lamp glowed dimly in the corner, casting golden light across a cluttered desk, half-filled bookshelves, and a threadbare armchair pulled close to the fireplace. The fire was already set. She'd done it out of habit before leaving that morning, and it only took a match to coax the flames to life. They caught slowly, curling around the kindling with a quiet determination. She made tea without thinking, boiled water, the same chipped blue mug, the same tin of loose leaf tucked behind the sugar. And then, at last, she sat. Not at the desk, but on the rug near the hearth, her knees drawn close, the fire warming one side of her face. The room smelled of rain-damp wool old paper, and something faintly citrus from the candle on the windowsill. Her satchel sat beside her. She reached in and pulled out the notebook, the one with soft corners and hesitant beginnings. She didn't open the poetry book just yet. Instead, she opened the notebook. She reached to turn a page, only to pause. A sheet, the one she'd scribbled that final thought on, was missing. She frowned slightly, flipping through the pages as if it might be tucked in the wrong place. But it wasn't there. For a moment, she simply stared at the space where it had been. Then, after a breath, she turned to a fresh page. She sat there for a while, staring at the paper, listening to the fire settle, letting the silence stretch not as emptiness, but as invitation. And then, slowly, she began to write. Not something polished, not for anyone else, just a few lines, a beginning. Because the shop hadn't solved anything. It hadn't told her what to do. It had only made space. And in that space, Clara remembered a part of herself she thought had gone quiet for good. She wasn't sure what the words would become, but tonight, they were enough. The clock above the poetry shelf chimed 4 soft notes, low, measured, like the sound of memory remembering itself. Henry stirred. He reached slowly for his coat, which had dried by the fire, its cuffs now warmed and faintly scented with smoke. With care, he brushed a bit of dust from the brim of his hat, then placed it gently atop his silver hair. Mr. Alcott glanced up from where he was tidying the counter. No words were exchanged, only a quiet nod passed between them, the kind reserved for those who have shared something still and unspoken. Miss Fenwick had already left. The teacup she'd used sat washed and drying beside the sink. The fire was low now, glowing rather than burning. Henry lingered for a moment longer in the warmth before turning to the door. He walked with the same deliberate rhythm that had brought him in, the light tap of his cane marking time against the timber floorboards. Outside, the street had grown darker, bathed in a cool, misty blue. The rain had long since stopped, but puddles still glittered beneath the gas lamps like scattered glass. The air smelled of damp stone, distant chimney smoke, and late-season leaves. His walk home was slow, not from age alone, but from intention. Every cobblestone was familiar, every crooked fence post, every ivy-draped wall. He passed the bakery, now closed, the shutters drawn, past the churchyard with its leaning gate and rusted hinges, and finally past the quiet street where his house waited, just as it always did. There were no lights on inside, no voices, just the steady tick of the hallway clock and the faint creak of cooling walls. He didn't expect the bookshop to fill what had been lost. It couldn't bring back laughter from rooms long quiet. It couldn't replace the way his son's coat used to hang slightly askew by the door, or the scent of lavender his wife wore on Sundays. But the shop remembered, in the way it kept the fire lit, in the tea brewed just right, in the silence that welcomed him without asking anything more. And in that small, steady offering, Henry felt something close to comfort. Not a cure, not a solution, just a place where his grief could stretch its legs and sit beside him a while. And sometimes, he thought, that was enough. The light through the windows had dimmed into that soft, in-between grey that comes just before dusk. Miss Fenwick had not turned another page in some time. Her eyes were still on the book, but her mind was elsewhere, gently adrift in thoughts stitched from memory and firelight. She could feel the warmth of the flames against her knees, the weight of the teacup long since emptied resting on her palm. Across from her, the chair Henry had occupied was now empty. Save for the faint outline he'd left in the cushion. She smiled to herself. There was something comforting about the familiar patterns of others, the rhythm of his visits, the way he always folded his hands before speaking, even when he had nothing to say. She looked down at her book, its pages familiar enough to recite, but tonight the words felt softer, more distant, not because she was tired, but because something inside her had quietly settled. A sense of contentment, like coming to the end of a sentence and knowing there's no need to add anything more. She rose slowly, folding the blanket with care, before laying it gently over the back of the chair. Mr. Alcott met her at the counter. He didn't ask if she'd enjoyed the read. He didn't need to. Instead, he handed her a small paper-wrapped parcel. The same book, borrowed so many times, now gently purchased and quietly gifted. She looked up at him, surprised. He only offered a small nod, as if to say, "You've earned it." Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and the street had that polished look it only got after a full day of gentle weather. Her shoes tapped lightly against the cobblestones as she walked. She would read tonight, in bed, with the lamp low and her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. But not chapter 7. Tonight, she would start from the beginning. Henry's front gate gave its usual soft groan as he pushed it open, a sound he'd grown used to, like a sigh that belonged only to this place. The garden was damp with rain, the stepping stones darkened and glistening. The hydrangeas were overgrown again. He'd meant to trim them. He stepped inside, shaking his umbrella gently before setting it in the stand. The house greeted him in its usual way, with silence and faint echoes. No lights on, no radio, just the tick of the clock in the hallway, marking time without concern. He left his coat on the hook, his shoes neatly beside the mat. It had once been a busy place, muddy boots, laughter from the kitchen, someone calling for a misplaced book or jacket. Now it was slower, quieter, but not empty. He moved to the sitting room and lit the fire, the old-fashioned way, with kindling and care. The logs caught quickly and the room began to warm. He placed the kettle on the stove and watched the flames reflect off the old glass in the cabinet doors. On the mantel, 3 framed photographs sat where they always had. Margaret, smiling in a garden full of foxgloves. Jamie, mid-laugh, missing a front tooth. The 3 of them together on a wind-swept holiday near the coast, all coats and squinting eyes and wind-blown hair. He didn't touch them, just looked for a while. The kettle began to hum. He poured the water, letting the tea steep in the same mug he used every night. With the fire low and steady, he lowered himself into the armchair, the one with the worn armrests and the quilt folded neatly over the back. He didn't pick up a book, not tonight. Instead, he let the thought of the shop linger, the warmth of the tea, the smell of wood smoke, the feeling of being surrounded by stories, even the ones that had ended. He closed his eyes. And in that quiet, the memory rose, slow and familiar. It was winter. Years ago, his wife, Margaret, was curled on the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, knitting something in soft grey wool. Their son, Jamie, 7 years old and always in mismatched socks, was lying belly down on the rug, a book splayed in front of him. The fire had looked much like this one. The same soft pop of dry wood, the same gentle hum of warmth against cold hands. Henry had been reading aloud, something about a prince who spoke to birds, his voice low, steady, occasionally tripping on a name he couldn't pronounce. Margaret would smile and correct him without looking up, her needles clicking in rhythm. Jamie would laugh and ask for the voices. "Do the owl again, Papa?" So he did, every time. There had been cocoa on the table, toast with too much butter, a blanket that kept slipping off the arm of the chair no matter how often he tucked it back. He remembered thinking, in that moment, that life was full, that he didn't need anything grand. Just this, the quiet sound of pages turning, the weight of his son's head against his knee as he drifted off to sleep, the firelight flickering in Margaret's eyes as she looked up from her knitting and mouthed, "Thank you." He had told no one that memory, not even Margaret, when she was still here. The stairs creaked softly beneath Mr. Alcott's weight. Not in protest, but in recognition. He climbed slowly, the day still folded neatly behind him, like the linen cloth he used to dust the shelves. The room above the shop was small, but not cramped. A single window overlooked the street below, its panes clouded with age. The curtains were drawn, but the faint glow of gas lamps shimmered through the fabric. Outside, the world was winding down. Inside, it already had. His bed was made, tightly, with corners folded sharp. The kind of habit you keep long after anyone notices. A bookshelf lined the opposite wall, smaller than the one downstairs, but more personal. Worn editions, many rebound by his own hand. A photo frame sat quietly among them. A black and white portrait of a woman in a collared dress. Her eyes soft but steady. He did not look at it often, but tonight he did. He placed the last cup of tea on the windowsill, steam rising slowly into the cool night air. Then, carefully, he sat in the old armchair beside the radiator, its upholstery faded from decades of late reading. His legs stretched, his fingers wrapped around the warmth of the tea, and for the first time all day, he let out a sigh that didn't have to go anywhere. He thought of the blue book downstairs, of the letter still tucked inside. He had written it once, long ago, unsigned, unsent, but never unread. It wasn't meant to be a message for someone else. Not exactly. It was a way to release something, a grief, a hope, a promise he hadn't yet found the courage to keep. And yet, the book had stayed on the shelf. He wondered if it had meant something different to Clara. He hoped so. Sometimes, the stories you leave behind become something else when someone else reads them. He sipped the tea slowly. Rain began again, soft, like fingers tapping on the glass. Below, the street was quiet, the shop dark and resting. He didn't feel lonely. The final light had faded from the sky by the time Mr. Alcott stood from behind the counter. The shop was empty now. The fire had dwindled to a soft glow, the kind that made shadows curl gently into the corners. He moved without urgency, as he always did, collecting cups, folding the blanket, straightening the parcel string left behind on the edge of the counter. Everything in its place. He turned off the reading lamp first, then the one above the doorway. Only the fireplace remained, casting its slow, pulsing light across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the cobbled street glistened beneath the gas lamps. Inside, the shop had begun to quiet in the way old buildings do, not with silence, but with a hush that held memory. He paused by the poetry shelf. The slim blue volume was still there, undisturbed. The letter remained tucked inside. He did not touch it. Not everything needed to be resolved. Mr. Alcott crossed the shop, his steps soft, his breath steady. He turned the door sign to closed, locked the latch, and drew the curtain over the window. For a moment, he stood still. The shop smelled of tea, wood smoke, and rain. He could still hear Miss Fenwick's page turning. He could see Henry's quiet gaze into the fire. He could feel Clara's pause when she found the book that had been waiting for her. He didn't know what the others had carried in with them. He didn't need to. He had offered them a quiet place. And sometimes that was all people truly needed. He blew out the last candle, climbed the stairs to the small room above the shop, and left the stories to rest. Tomorrow would come, and the bell would ring again.